I'm hoping that we can continue to be a resource to the community as well as to our own college in providing a kind of clearinghouse or place where we can have conversations about the value and importance of wine in society and in Oregon. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Susan, our new Vice President for Academic Affairs, Susan Eger-Kippenhahn. Susan joined us last summer. She has known tonight's speaker for a couple of years, and I think had something to do with his coming to be here, and I'm very grateful to Susan for having made this possible.
Thanks. Thanks, and I was going to say, if there's any spots open.
There's one seat over here.
One, okay, so if anybody wants to go over. It's my pleasure actually to introduce our speaker for tonight, geologist Dr. Scott Burns, and he'll be speaking on the mystery of terroir in Oregon, the relationship of geology, soil, and climate to wine. Scott is lecturing across the country this year after being named the 2011-12 Richard H. Jans Distinguished Lecturer in Engineering Geology by the Association of Environmental and Engineering Geologists, AEG, and the Geology Society of America, GSA. Those are his two sponsoring associations. Scott Burns is a professor of geology at Portland State, and he has a lot of research interests. In addition to the one we'll be talking about tonight, he is a soil and rock guy. Is that fair? Environmental geology, soils, landslides, engineering geology, and he's written a book on the Missoula floods. His BS and MS degrees are from Stanford University, his PhD from the University of Colorado. He's the author for outstanding teaching. He won the 2011 Public Service Award from GSA and the 2006 Meritorious Service Award from the same organization. And I am pleased to say that I've had the pleasure of knowing Scott for quite a number of years before I came to Linfield. And we actually began to talk about the possibility of him coming here for this night in this past fall at a colleague's inaugural activities. It's very exciting to have Scott. As President Helly mentioned, we have a deep interest at Linfield in wine from our wine archives, which have been led by our library director, Susan Barnes-White, and our archivist, Rachel Woody, where we're documenting the history of wine in our region. The Linfield Center for the Northwest with the director, Jeff Peterson, who will actually lead the Q&A, and where we connect with regional relevant partnerships for collaborative research, internships, and projects. You may know of the work they've done with the IPNC around exhibitions and the video they created last year. And our interests go to the points of business and economics. And we're also pleased to say that the Linfield College Board of Trustees includes winemakers and definitely wine enthusiasts. Tonight, the talk will focus on what the French call terroir, meaning the taste of the place. Scott will talk about the 5 characteristics: grapes, climate, soil hydrology, the physiography of the site, bedrock geology, and the resulting soils. We'll look at the mystery of terroir in the Willamette Valley, whose soils come from the Columbia River basalt, which originated in eastern Oregon, and the marine sedimentary rocks found in the foothills of the Oregon Coast Range. And while Scott is local, he told me tonight that he has logged, we are his 113th lecture as the Jans Distinguished Lecturer. So I hope you have a little bit more in you. And
Hopefully.
I'm also delighted to say that Scott actually boasts deep family roots right here in Yadkin County. So Scott, we're delighted you could be here tonight. Thanks.
Wow, what a privilege to be here tonight in a packed room. I see around here a lot of winemakers, a lot of people who work in wineries, and this is exciting for me. So tonight what we want to do is talk a little bit about terroir. First of all, Tom, thank you very much for hosting it. Susan and I were colleagues at Portland State for many, many years. They did a wonderful job in hiring her, and so Linfield is in great shape here. And I know Tom is a wonderful president, and so it's great. My great-great-great-grandparents homesteaded here, and so my cousin still lives on the family farm where we've had somebody living for 150 years. So if you go from Dayton to Amity on the road there's a little road off of there called Burns Road. You go right up there, up on the top of the hill, that's where my cousin Rob lives. And so we've been here for a long time. I've got roots in here. I love Linfield. Linfield is doing so many things related to the wine industry. It's exciting. It's lovely to see old students here and friends. And so thank you very much for coming out tonight. I have been involved in wines forever. I went to Stanford way back in the 60s, and there was a fledgling little area developing with wines called the Napa Valley. And so my fraternity brothers and I would go up tasting, and we could do the whole thing in one day, starting at Martini and Mondavi and ending up with Christian Brothers and Charles Krug. And now look at what's happened there. I started teaching in 1970, a young assistant professor, and I was teaching in Switzerland, and I taught biology in addition to geology and also chemistry. And in the class, we were right in the heart of the wine district in Switzerland. This is where I was teaching, and I made wine with my students every year because you can learn an awful lot of science from that. And so if you could turn down the lights, and by the way, this is the major photo that I have here. This is actually taken up in the Washington side on a volcano. Hood River is right down there in the bottom. Another area that is developing and producing some really, really good wines up there. But here's a picture of me in 1973 as a young assistant professor. And this is what I looked like back in those days. My wife Glenda is down here. This is who she married. Have changed a wee bit. But here are some of the bottles of wine that I made there. And my first article I ever published was in 1976 in the journal College Science Teaching called Science Can Be Fun and Tasty, Winemaking in the Lab. So I've been involved in this for a long time. I came back to Portland State in 1990, and I'm a geologist, but one of my specialty areas is soil. So I got involved in soil. And I was very interested in the soils that were being used in the vineyards. And so tonight what we want to do is talk to you a little bit about that. In our research, I got a PhD student working in terroir. I think, after having visited all the major wine producing areas in the world, I think this is the best place in the world to taste terroir. Why? Because we have major differences in the soils, and therefore you can have differences in the wines in a very, very short area. And we'll talk a little bit about that. All of you who are winemakers or owners of wineries, you will be getting a letter from me sometime in the next 2 weeks, because I have a major article that came out on geology and terroir in a new book that came out called Geography of Wine of the World. And so Greg Jones from Southern Oregon wrote the climatology one. I wrote the geology and soil one. And so you'll get a copy because I relate back to the Oregon northern Willamette Valley. So let's talk a little bit about terroir. But anytime you have a bottle of wine, it's going to be different from the next one and the next one and the next one based on what I called 7 factors. Number 1, the grape type. And so a Cabernet is going to be different from a Pinot Noir, different from a Chardonnay. And then here in Oregon, we go a step further and we get into the clones in the Pinot Noirs and the Chardonnays. Secondly, the geology. And the geology, the bedrock is going to break down into the soils, and the soils are going to provide all of the nutrients that are going to go into the plants, and I'm going to be focusing a lot on that area tonight, and it's very important. Thirdly, the climate. And you have macroclimate, you've got microclimate. And everybody who grows grapes knows the microclimate types of things, but macroclimate, very, very important. And then next, soil hydrology. And so how much sand, silt, and clay is going to be in the soil, holding water in there, especially late in the season when it gets very, very dry. So there's going to be some water that is going to be held there at that time. Physiography, that is elevation and direction of the slope. And so in the northern hemisphere, we want to maximize the heat units that we have. So you want south-facing slopes. And around here, the rule of thumb is basically between 300 and 800 feet elevation. Below that 300 feet elevation, you got Missoula flood sediments, which we'll talk about a little bit, and also you have early and late season frost, and above 800 feet, sometimes you don't mature the grapes. And so these 5 are what traditionally the French would call terroir. And I'll come back to that in a second. But there are also 2 other major factors that are very, very important. And one is the winemaker, and the winemaker is going to be asking, what type of yeast am I going to be using? Am I going to do malolactic fermentation? Am I going to use oak? What type of oak am I going to do? How long am I going to do that? All these questions that are involved there. And then vineyard management. Do your rows go north-south? Do they go east-west? What type of trellis do you use? Do you use cover crop? There's all of those are factors that are going to be tied together. And so terroir, and so I lived in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, so I love French. And our local winemakers would talk about the terroir of their vineyard. But it's the total elements of the vineyards. It's the bedrock geology. It's the texture of the soil, sand, silt, clay, the structure, the depth of the soil, drainage. You want to have well-drained soils. And in Oregon, two important things, color and age. You want to have, and we'll come back to that in a second, orientation of slope and elevation. Now, a few years ago, we had the first North American Terroir Conference, which was held down in Mecca of winemaking, and that was down at Davis, UC Davis, in the Mondavi Center. And so there were 300 of us that met there. I was one of 5 or 6 people from Oregon. We spent 3 days discussing what is terroir and debating back and forth and hearing all these talks. We drank huge amounts of wine, came up with no conclusions, and so everybody has different definitions of what terroir is going to be. But the important thing is, I really like the definition, the taste of the place. So we have Dick Erath here in the group here, and this is a quote from an article that quoted him in the past. 80% of the quality of the vineyard, of the wine comes from the vineyard, 20% from the winery. He's a terroirist. And my aim tonight is to turn all of you into terroirists. Now, we aren't going to tell Homeland Security about that at the end of the night, but and a lot of you know a lot about this. And so I apologize, if I'm repeating some things that you know, but then some of you may not. So if we look at the macro climate as we go around the world, in a map of the world, all of the vineyards in the northern hemisphere are between 30 and 45 or 50 degrees north latitude, whether you're in the United States or in Europe. Even China is producing huge amounts of wine right now, and I've had a chance to taste some of them. Not very good, but they are producing huge quantities, and their chateaus look just like they were out of France. And then you go down in the southern hemisphere in Chile with their Carmeneres and the Malbecs out of Mendoza. Oh my God, and I'll talk a little bit about the Mendoza area. South Africa, absolutely great, Stellenbosch. Australia, and then Glenda and I used to live in New Zealand. And so I'll mention a couple things about that coming up. So the climate is important. Now, anytime we talk about terroir, we've got to go back and talk about France. And so the major grape growing areas that we have got in France, Burgundy, we are the Burgundy of North America here in the northern Willamette Valley. And so really from here on north, these are the cool climate areas in France. And then the southern portions down here, warm climate. And I'm going to come back to the climate in a second. Bordeaux being the most famous down there, Burgundy up here, also the Rhone that is over here. When you look at a wine label that comes out of France, they are going to have the name of the wine. They are going to have the winery that you have got. They're going to have the region. They're going to have the grade if you're from Burgundy or down in Bordeaux. You're going to have the region. You're going to have the year, the amount of alcohol. But nowhere on there you're going to find the grapes that go into it. You're supposed to know the terroir of the area that you have got, except the Alsace area. They actually put the grapes on it. And here in the United States, we are really used to, I like Merlots, I like Cabs, I like Syrahs. And we look for those things, but in France, they don't. If it's red and it's from Burgundy, you know it's a Pinot Noir. If it's white and it's from Burgundy, you know it's a Chardonnay. If it's red and from Beaujolais, you know it's a Gamay grape. And if it's red and it's from Bordeaux, you know it's probably going to be a blend of Cab Merlot and Cab Franc, and etc. And so the French terroir is so important. For many, many years in the United States, we kind of poo-pooed the notion. But I find it extremely helpful. And here in the Willamette Valley, it is very important, as you will see later. So this is Burgundy. Our equivalent in Europe, the climate is very, very similar. Geology is different, primarily marls and limestones over there, uplifted marine sediments, whereas here we are primarily uplifted marine sediments, sandstones and shales, and then basalt, and then Missoula flood sediments. So we'll come back to that in a second. And we'll mention a couple things here. Bordeaux is quite interesting because the best vineyards are down along the river. And back in the 1700s, when you had all these nouveaux riches, they had a lot of money, but they had no land. They hired a lot of Dutch. And they got the Dutch to come down and build a lot of levees, and they drained all the wetlands. And so all of those flat areas along the river became the really, really good vineyards. And it's interesting because when you go through a lot of those vineyards, there isn't much soil. There's not sand, silt, and clay, but a lot of gravels and cobbles. And I'm going to come back to that later on. And in fact, it's very close, they're very similar to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which you look in this vineyard here, where's the soil? Well, you don't have to have soil, as we will see as we are coming up in a second. So let's go back to Burgundy, where the monks have been categorizing the grapes there for 400 years. And they knew every year which area had the best the grapes. And so in the Cordon area, there is a line above which every year the grapes were really the best, whether it was Chardonnays or the Pinots, and those were the Grand Cru. And then below that line was the Premier Cru, which is the next best. Well, geologists went in and took a look at that line in cross-section. So here's the line, and all the way up the upper slope, that was all one geological unit. It was marl. And so marl is a limestone with a little bit of silt thrown in, so it's a dirty one. Whereas from here down to the common wines here, those are outcrops of primarily pure limestone. And then down in here, it's what we call alluvium, stream sediments, and so it's a mixture of a lot of different things, and that's where you get the common wines. So in that particular area, the geology is having a lot of effect on the wine. And the quality of the wine doesn't matter who the winemakers are, it is the terroir, of the earth. And so when we grow our grapes, here we primarily use Vitis vinifera. I've had a chance to go coast to coast. I gave a talk at Middlebury College 2 months ago, and they said, well, can you give a talk at a winery afterwards in the evening? I said, sure. And 50 people came to the talk at the winery. They have 7 wineries in Vermont. In fact, every one of the states has got a winery. And 2 people actually drove down from Quebec. But they're primarily American hybrids. In fact, last week I was in Rolla, Missouri. And so all American hybrids, and so I tasted quite a few, and some of them were actually okay. And so it's different. Out here we do primarily Vitis vinifera that we have got. Now, probably the top wine climatologist in the world is here from Oregon. Greg Jones, he's a professor at Southern Oregon University. And Greg and I do a lot of talks together. We are great friends. And so what he has done is looked at the climatology of all of the major grape growing areas. So over here we've listed the major grape growing areas here. And then if you don't know where they are, I've put in here a list of where they are. And so we can either look at heat units and hours of the temperature over 50 degrees, or what he has done, he's done a regression, he has average temperature, and he's put that into that, so I use that there. It doesn't matter. And then what he has defined is cool climate grapes, intermediate warm, warm, and hot. And so the northern Willamette Valley, we are in the cool climate grape area, as is the Loire Valley of France, Burgundy, and then the German areas, the Rhone and the Moselle and the Alsace in northern France. And so those are the average temperatures that you got, and so you match up the grapes that you have got there. Then you come down to the intermediate warm, so you got central and eastern Washington, you got Chile, you've got the Beaujolais area, and then you got southern Oregon. And so that is the intermediate warm, and then you come down in here and you get into the California wines and also some of the Spanish wines, Italian wines, and then you get into the really hot areas like Lodi, California, where they grow those Zinfandels, hot, hot, hot. And so he's defined all of those areas by the temperature that you have got. And now what you do is you want to match up the grapes with the climate that you have. And so you've got cool, intermediate, warm, warm, and hot. And so your cool climate grapes are going to be your German-style ones, your Müller-Thurgaus, Gewürztraminers, and Rieslings, and then Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay. And then as you get over here, then you start getting into the more warm climate grapes and the intermediate warm, the warms, and etc. And then when you get into the really hot ones, then you're down here at the very, very bottom. So what you try and do is match up those. Did I screw up?
Raisins.
Oh yes, raisins. Yeah, so you really want a lot of hot down in those areas there. And the Zinfandels or Nebbiolos, etc. And so you want to match the climate up. Now, one of the things that's interesting, as many of us believe, is the climate is changing. And so what is happening is these boundaries are moving. And so what we're finding here in the Willamette Valley is some of the people are actually planting Syrahs, hoping that, as it warms up a little bit, that we'll be able to have Syrahs. And some other ones. The other thing that Greg is pointing out is that down in the Napa Valley, it may be too warm for some of theirs, and they may going to have to shift over more into the Zinfandels and less away from some of the wines that are over on this side. We're now seeing, Greg and I were at a conference in New York back in January. We're seeing England planting lots and lots of grapes, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Areas that never had grapes because it was too cool, now possibly they can have those. And then in Germany, they are, in addition to the whites, they're also getting into the Pinot Noirs. So climate, very, very important. So if you want to have a great vineyard, you want to have at least 180 frost-free days. Mineral nutrients is an interesting thing, the soil thing. And it's contrary to normal agricultural production. First of all, when you have your garden in the backyard where you're growing carrots and radishes and lettuce, what do? You fertilize everything. Well, in the vineyard, you don't want to fertilize everything. You don't want to give it too many nutrients because it will produce too much vigor. And you want to reduce the amount of vigor in the plant. And so you want just enough nutrients to keep that plant alive. And so what are you talking about? Calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and phosphorus. Those are the natural things that you would have there. So you want to just have just enough mineral nutrients that are there. And it's a key to making wines here in Oregon. You want to have it well drained. I'll come back to that in a second. Your perfect vineyard is 7 to 8 degrees facing south for the maximum heat units, maximum elevation around 800 feet. And as the climate changes, it may rise up. But the last few years it's been pretty cold and it had problems up there. Now, it's interesting when Greg and I were back in New York, the New Yorkers talk about minimum temperature that you get in the soils. And so the Finger Lakes area there, they grow a lot of Rieslings and German-style wines. And so they can do that because the temperature rarely gets below 15 degrees. But if you get below negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit, too many plants die every year. And so that is a limiting factor that they use in that area. If it doesn't get below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, then you can grow the cool climate grapes. And then if it doesn't get below negative 5 degrees, that's warm climate grapes out on Long Island. That's where they grow Cabs, Merlots, and Syrahs out there. And so they have the temperature, the maritime, that is there. So these are some of the characteristics you have. Now let's look at the soils. And there are 16 basic nutrients, elements that you need to have, that the plants need. They have 10 macronutrients. And so you got carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and chlorine. And then the micronutrients, iron, manganese, zinc, copper, boron, and molybdenum. A lot of times if your leaves start getting brown and stuff like that, they'll sample the soils. And a lot of times you're maybe a little bit low in boron or molybdenum, and sometimes you have to add a little bit in those areas. Another key thing are the trace elements. And the trace elements, very, very important because these become involved in the enzymes. And the enzymes are very, very important in especially producing the complexity that you get in your wines. And so we are investigating all of these in soils right now and then following them through in the wines that are being produced in the vineyards that you got. So out of these things here, 3 of them come out of the water and the atmosphere, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and all the rest of them are coming out of the soils. So the soils are very, very important. And so some important things about soils and terroir I wanted to mention. Number one, depth of the soil. And you try and match the particular plant that you have got to the soil. Certain ones like Chardonnay likes a deep soil, whereas Syrah tends to like more shallow soils. And some of them don't really matter. pH of the soil is very, very important. Normal range that you like is somewhere between 5.5 and 10. Now when it's below that or above that, you run into problems. If it's below that, uptake of phosphorus is reduced. If it is above that, uptake of iron, copper, zinc, and manganese is a problem. And that it will inhibit root growth. Salinity, so growing grapes out in the desert. The more salt that you have in the soils can be problematic because it will affect the uptake of the phosphorus. Texture, that is the sand, silt, and clay, that's going to, especially the silt in the clay, is going to affect how much water holding capacity that you have, and especially at the end of the season when everything is very, very dry. Structure, that is how all of these particles are held together. You want to have some strength to it, so therefore you can run machinery over it. And then also it leads to deep root penetration. Drainage, as I mentioned before, very, very important, especially for our red grapes. Too much of that will cause the grapes to swell. Clay content. The clay is the very, very finest grained particles, smaller than silt, and then silt is smaller than sand. But too high values of that will reduce the amount of root penetration. In the next slide, I'll tell you how it affects taste. Color, very important, the color of the soil. The darker the color, it will absorb more heat, and that will lead to a faster maturation. Secondly, the red color, which we want around here, it will indicate well-drained soils. Rockiness it also will affect the maturation. The more rocks that you have got, the faster the maturation will also lead to deep root penetration. And then when you got limestone and caliche, we don't have a lot of either of those around here, but they will lead to shallow rooting depths and also cause the roots to go laterally. Now, so we scoured the literature, talking about vigor and then flavors related to the soils. Vigor is a real problem. And what is vigor? It's a lack of balance between the vegetative part and the reproductive part. We've just passed bud break, and I know that there are a lot of smiles on a lot of vineyard managers and winemakers here because it's a couple weeks earlier than it was last year. And then, yes, and so when that plant comes back to life in the spring, it's just like it says, what is my raison d'etre? What is my reason of being? It is to reproduce. And so therefore, if you've got lots and lots of nutrients in the system and lots of water, and he said, I have plenty of time to reproduce, and so what will I do? I'll grow leaves and stems and leaves and stems, go on and do that, and then by the end of the season, when it's time to reproduce, you don't get it done in time, and your Brix levels just aren't high enough. But if you come back to life and life is tough and not enough water and no nutrients in the soil, they say life is tough, I got to put that energy into that grape. That's what the winemaker wants to do. And so as a result, you want to reduce that vigor. And so where does the vigor come from? Too many nutrients, too much water. And so if you have that, it will lead to poor fruit setting, and then also it will slow down the ripening. Red grapes, and it will also lead to reduction in the development of the red color and also some of the phenolic compounds, which are so important in the complexity that you have got. Interesting, I used to live in New Zealand. And the main wine, they export over now $1 billion worth of Sauvignon Blanc every year, which I love from down there. And it's this very fruity flavor. And those aromatic compounds needs a lot of nitrogen. And so in some of these types of soils, they have to add a wee bit of nitrogen, and that leads to that particular characteristic. So how about the soils and flavors? What we find is when you have the calcareous soils, like the limestones or the caliche is a white layer that develops in a soil in arid environments. You develop more lemon and citrusy flavors. Marl soils, like you get in Burgundy, like the upper part of the Corton area that we had there, peppery flavors. Sandstones, it's kind of nervy. Now, I had to look up nervy in the book, but it's a balance between the acids and the sugars that you have got. Clay-rich soils, very interesting. The more clay that you've got, the more tannins that you have got. And especially if you're going for the big heavy reds, you want to age the soils an awful lot, and so therefore you need to have a lot of tannins that are going to be in there. Schist, well, schist is a metamorphic rock. You know, geologists have their schist together. They've got it gives nothing. Stresses the austere nature of the wine. And then volcanic soils, like we have around here, tends to give more full-bodied wines and smoke-based aromas. And so therefore, those are some of the things that affect them. Now, one of my favorite experiments, Terry Wright, who's a geology professor down at, now retired at Sonoma State University. And so he worked with Iron Horse Vineyards in Sebastopol there. And he had two vineyards, Vineyard A, Vineyard B. And the soil, everything was the same. All those factors that I showed you at the beginning, the winemaker, the vineyard techniques, I think these were Cabernets that they did here. And so Vineyard A had 42% clay in the soil, which is a lot. and then about 20% clay here. What he found was that the colors were very, very deep cherry colors and berry colors, and then you have very, very strong flavors that are here. But in the lower clay one, more delicate ones. And so you had softer tannins, bigger nose, more aromatic compounds, and lighter color. And so the wine taster, he gave the wines to blind tasting to tasters, and they liked the second one down here than this one. So again, there's a difference. And so it is a factor that is important. Is it the most important? No. I really think that the winemaker is the most important of all of those factors, but it affects the terroir. I still look back to 1997 when it was our El Nino year, and it was a disaster for many, many of the vineyards. I still remember Lynn Penner-Ash at Rex Hill. She had a lot of Pinot that she needed to market, and so her son drew the label, and they marketed it as Vino del Nino, and I don't know if you remember that. And it is just not a good year. This last one, 2007, where we had another El Nino year, some of those wines are excellent. And what's the difference, I think? It is the winemakers. They understand the system. They know when we have a bad year, and we have bad years like we did last year. They are doing a really, really good job. And so it's fun to see our industry maturing to the point that we're producing some outstanding wines. And so I've got a chance, for instance, to go down to Mendoza in Argentina. So Aconcagua, one of the big volcanoes that are there, here are the Andes, and all of the vineyards that are found down there in the land of the Malbec are on what we call alluvial fans from the erosion of from the Andes up here. And then because the Andes are moving up, the streams are down cutting, and so they have terraces that are there. And so the highest terraces are the oldest ones, as is the overall plane of the alluvial fan. The older it is, the more caliche that is going to be in it, because this is an arid environment. And so we did a survey down there, and the best, the most famous of all the Malbecs were always on the highest ones, where you had the highest amount of caliche. As you went down onto the youngest surfaces with the least amount of caliche, the quality of the Malbecs went down. So again, terroir, very important that is there. Australia is an interesting continent. They're producing some absolutely great big reds down there. But the soils are old, red, wherever you go. And then if you get into limestone, this is what we call a terra rosa soil, and they are extremely red. And so they affect the grape growing that you have in those areas. And then in New Zealand, it's mostly on alluvium. These are stream terraces, or just the stream areas next to the streams. Mostly gray wacky bedrock, which is a dirty sandstone. And so it is producing, I think, just absolutely great Sauvignon Blancs that are down there. So let's go back and talk a little bit about Oregon, and we go back to the early days. And David Lett, when he came up here in 1961, and he wanted to produce Burgundian type of wines, and so Pinot Noirs and Pinot Gris. And then the famous competition where he went over to France, and the French were afterwards. They said, "Qu'est-ce que c'est, où est Oregon? What is happening here? Where is this Oregon place?" Because they're producing some very, very good Pinots, and to this day, we are producing many of them. And so back in those days, and so last year, the numbers, we were approximately 420 wineries, and every day this number goes up a little bit more, over 17,000 acres that we have got here, 60 to 40% red to white in the state. So here in the northern Willamette Valley, I don't have to tell you, we're cool climates. So Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, and then the German-style wines, but not the Merlots, the Cabs, and Syrahs. Now, many of the wineries have those, but they're importing the grapes from southern Oregon or from eastern Washington, and they're producing some very good ones there. If we look at the number of wineries in the United States, how does Oregon stack up? Well, we're way behind California, but we're in number 3 position, and this is data from just a couple of years ago. New York is in number 4. Texas, I've gotten a chance. I've tasted a lot of Texas wines. Didn't like any one, but on my after lecturing at Baylor University down there in January, they took me out to Lone Oak Winery, and I tasted 12 wines, all very good, and 2 of them really good. So again, as they start to mature, they're going to be getting more of them. But when you look at wine production, what happens? New York comes into second place. And it's things like Manischewitz, Boone's Farm, Ripple, and things like that, in addition to everything else, but we're in fourth place that is there. But the impact on our economy is incredible. I don't have to tell many of you that. It's important, and it's growing, and it's exciting to see that happen that we have here. So we have over 400 wineries, over 840 vineyards. And so a lot of people are sourcing their grapes out, and it's wonderful to see that, and I know that some of you here are producing those grapes and selling them to the wineries. But $300 million every year just in direct sales of wines. Very, very important for us in our economy here. Number of planted acres versus the harvested acres, and again, the difference is the first couple of years you don't get any grapes that are there. So here is Pinot Noir, the heart of the northern Willamette Valley, and I love Pinots. Geologists always get into the field, any excuse to get out and take a look at the terroir. Here we are at Willackenzie Estate with Ronnie, one of the co-owners that is there. And we are checking out the soils and then sipping the wines. But Willackenzie was the first winery in the United States to name the winery after the soil. Why? Because her husband, Bernard, at that time, was French. And he said the terroir is very important. And so therefore, we need to name the winery after the soil. Any time to get into the vineyard, this is at Erath Winery. And George Moore, right here, as a geologist, he actually finished a book on the geology of the wine country. He finished the first edition, then was killed the next week in an automobile accident. So Greg Jones and myself are trying to update that, and maybe that'll be coming out soon. But here we are in the northern Willamette Valley, and now we have all these sub-AVAs that have developed here in this area. Why? It is terroir. And the people in the Dundee Hills said, our wines are great because we have primarily the Jory soils. And then the people in Yamhill Carlton were saying, no, our soils are primarily Willackenzie, and so therefore we want to put that onto the bottles. And then the people down in the Eola Hills, where they have a lot of Jory and Nikaya, they said, no, we want to put the Eola Hills on it. Chehalem Mountain has a lot of laurelwood soil. And they said, no, we want to put Chehalem Mountain on it. Ribbon Ridge have a very, very distinct ridge, higher elevation Willackenzie. So we want that. And then now you also have the McMinnville area. So you have all of these defined areas based on terroir, on the geology, on the soils, and it is exciting to see that happen. So back in the mid to late 90s, a graduate student and myself did a survey of over 200 vineyards and that were found in the northern Willamette Valley. And so we did 5,000 acres, and we asked, what are the soils that we're growing on? And the three of them were dominant, and that was the Jory, the Willackenzie, and the laurelwood. And still to this day, we are still seeing the same ratios that you have got. We ended up finding 23 different ones. Some of these are being remapped by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But let me go back to the beginning. The first name that we have here is the USDA Soil Series name. And that name was given by the place generally where it was first described. The second column I put here, the bedrock. Basalt is one of them. Columbia River basalt. This is 14, 15 million-year-old basalt. All that basalt came from eastern Oregon, where Oregon, Washington, and Idaho come together. There were volcanoes very, very similar to Hawaii. The magma came out, oozed out, and just flowed into the rivers. Primarily, the Columbia River came all the way down the ancestral Columbia River and then deposited in this area, and then it's been uplifted into the hills because of crunching that we have had. And then you've got the Willackenzie soils, which are developed primarily on uplifted marine sediments, the coast range that you have got. And so those are primarily sandstones and siltstones. As we go to the east side of this area, it's primarily Pittsburgh Bluff sandstone. So those are all beaches. And then as we go to the west a little bit more, then you get into some more clays and sandstones, and so you're getting a little bit further offshore. And then Laurelwood is primarily basalt. For instance, a great place is going to be Chehalem Mountain, but you have a lot of windblown silt that has come off of the valley bottoms that is mixed in, and it's old loess. The term that we use is loess, L-O-E-S-S. It has many different pronunciations in geology. If you're from the Midwest, they call it Luss. If you're from the South, we call it Loess. And if you're German, you call it Lurs. In the West, we call it Luss. But it gets in and it mixes, and then what happens, it weathers. So it's going to be red, but it has little iron concretions, piezolites. And some people say that those piezolites are very important and maybe giving some additional cherry flavors. And we're hoping to check some of this out in the future. And so these are the three dominant ones. Altasol is a name of an order of soil. It means totally wiped out, no nutrients in it, very, very low nutrients. It has been around millions of years. And the alpha sol is still old, it's red, but it has a few more nutrients that you have got. Woodburn down here, Missoula flood sediments, we'll talk about that in a second. And so the great debate as I talk about it is in the Willamette Valley, the three major soils, which soil is producing the best Pinot Noir? And if you have a winemaker, and you keep all those factors constant, the winemaker, the vineyard techniques, and everything else except the soils, they can make wines from the three different vineyards. They will come out different. Now, everybody will agree that they're different, but how you classify them or how you describe them is everybody's off the scale on that. And I'll show you an example, me versus Ken Wright, in a second. But the bottom line is that they are different. And so that's why I find it very, very exciting here in the Northern Willamette Valley that we have all of these choices. And so Willackenzie Winery, which is famous for its Willackenzie soils, now has bought property in the Dundee Hills. And so Bernard can now, the people going into the tasting room can taste Willackenzie versus Jory. And yesterday I was just out at Elk Cove, and so they've got all three, and so people can taste all of those. And people are wanting to do this, and it's an exciting place, I think, to do wine tasting because of the great diversity that we have got. And so here we got the heart of the Dundee Hills. And the red soils, remember the redder the better. And here is the Jory soil. Nice A horizon here, and then the B horizon has lots of clay in it, but it's well drained because it's very, very red. This is our new state soil. And I spent 12 years trying to get this through the legislature and finally succeeded this past year. And back in 1992, all of the soil science societies of each state were asked by the Soil Science Society of America, please pick a state soil. One that has a lot of agricultural acreage, grows a lot of crops, and is very distinctive. And so we scientifically went through all the soil soil series in Oregon and came up with the Jory. And the reason was that about 7 or 8 years ago, they opened up an exhibit in the Smithsonian called Just Dig It. And they wanted to have a monolith of the state soil of each one of the states, and they're there. Now, out of those 50 state soils, 60% of them have been officially accepted by the legislature, and so we finally got this through here. And it just happens to be one of the main soils for the production of wines. Here is up at Elk Cove. I got a wine bottle here. Here is the Willackenzie type of soil that is up there. It's a little overexposed, but it is red. It is old. It's got lots of clay in it, well drained, and a great soil. Now, a lot of times, so here is my approach to the Jory versus Willackenzie. And especially in the early days, I could a lot of times tell the difference just in the colors that you had got, because I'd get light colors from the Jorys and the basalts and darker colors in the marine sediments. And so some of the flavors that were associated with those. Now, Ken Wright, who has been pushing terroir for years, and if you go to his website, every one of his wines, he talks about the terroir there. He says, Burns, you don't know what you're talking about. You're a geologist. Geologists normally drink wine out of boxes. And he's much better than I am. And so he said, look, the basalts and the jories are primarily fruit-driven flavors, where the marine sediments are more floral and spice. He's probably closer to what the reality is. But the thing is, everybody will agree, they're different. And it's exciting to taste these. And then, every year we have a different climate. And so yesterday we were tasting 2009s and 2010s. And oh my God, keeping all the factors constant except the climate. And so you have climate differences, and then you have soil differences. It's a fun place to taste. And wine experts tell us that there are two major soils that are transparent, where you can taste the terroir through the grapes. And one is Pinot Noir, the other is Riesling. And Pinot Noir, with the thin-skinned grape, it is a perfect one to taste. Now, why is the valley floor bad for growing grapes? It's not bad. You can grow grapes, and a lot of people do around here, but the geology is primarily the Missoula flood sediments. Missoula flood sediments are loaded with nutrients: calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and phosphorus. And I'll have a slide in just a second talking about where they came from. So all of the energy goes into the leaves and into the stems, and so you can grow grapes, but you're going to have to trim back those to reduce that vigor quite a bit. So it's going to be more expensive to do that. Also, it's going to take longer to ripen, and you get the early frosts, which also can be bad. So we've tended to stay off of those for the best wines. We also have the Burns poison oak hypothesis. And a lot of people call up and say, well, should I buy on this piece of property? I want to invest money in a vineyard. And I say the first question you ask the real estate agent or the owner is, do they have poison oak on the property? Poison oak loves to grow on south-facing slopes in our area between 300 and 800 feet elevation. And we tried to test the hypothesis, only came out 68%, but a lot of times the farmers have been farming the land for 50 to 100 years, and they didn't know if there was any there originally. But I think if you took virgin land, you would find that it would hit pretty close to 100%. So that's the story from the northern Willamette Valley. But we also have some other great areas down in the Umpqua, down in the Rogue area. The rocks are a lot older. And so the terroir is different. And also the climate is different. And they're producing some really, really good wines down there too. And it's fun to go tasting in those areas too. So our next venture is, with my grad students, is to head south and start studying a little bit more of the terroir down there. And then as we go up the Columbia Valley, and they're producing some great wines up in there, up in the Hood River and the Dalles area, and then up into eastern Washington. I just wanted to, at the end, just compare Oregon versus Washington. And so in Washington, you have got all of the AVAs. Now, Columbia River Valley is the major one that you have got, but you got Luke Slope, the Tri-Cities area, Red Mountain, Walla Walla, Yakima Valley, Alderdale, that are down in here. And so here is the normal soils that you find in the Walla Walla Valley. Red Mountain, which is one of my favorite AVA areas up there. These are all Missoula flood sediments. Very, very exciting places up there. Look at this plant does not have a lot of vigor that you got there, but they're producing some really nice looking grapes there. Prosser, again, lots of vineyards that you find up there. And then Columbia Crest wineries. This is the Columbia River. There's Oregon. This is Washington, south-facing slopes, all Missoula flood sediments. And so this is from the Yakima Valley. And what you've got here is an ice-rafted boulder that came down on the Missoula floods. In Washington, 95% of all of the vineyards are on the Missoula flood sediments. Whereas here in Oregon, northern Willamette Valley, it's only 10%. So there's a major difference that we have got here. What are the Missoula floods? Well, I rewrote a book called Cataclysms on the Columbia, the Great Missoula Floods. And if we go back at the tail end of the last glacial period, you had the glaciers coming down from up in Canada. But there was one arm that filled up a valley in northern Idaho. See, that's that northern part of Idaho, Pend Oreille Valley. And it came down and it dammed up the major river that was draining western Montana, the Clark Fork River. And so you had about 50 cubic miles of ice, dammed this up, and it filled up all of the valley bottoms, and it created a huge lake that we call Glacial Lake Missoula, all the way back to Missoula. And then what happened, up to 530 cubic miles of water. Eventually that ice dam broke. all of that water was liberated in 3 days. All of it came down, catastrophically down through Spokane, and carved out all of these valleys up here into what we call the Channel Scablands. All of that water came back into the Columbia River down here and eroding all of the loess, the Palouse loess that was up in this area. And all the water came down the Columbia River, hit Portland, and some of it went out into the ocean, but a large portion of it came down between West Lynn and Oregon City and filled up the Willamette Valley. And also went through Lake Oswego and filled up the Tualatin Valley to a 400 feet elevation. So you had a lake that lasted 2 to 3 weeks here, and then eventually all that water went back out into the ocean. But all that eroded sediment from up here was brought down here and deposited here. And then up here where you had really, really catastrophic high velocities that were in this area, you had lots of deposits there. Here is my equivalent up in Washington, Alan Busaka. He was now a retired professor of soils at Washington State University. He studies terroir, and he also does vineyard soil surveys. He also owns a couple vineyards. In fact, we're at Columbia Crest Winery. Or the vineyards that are there. You can see these deposits back there. You look right there. Those are Mount St. Helens ashes, and it helps give us dates. And it's right in the tail end of the last, a couple of the last floods. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So the terroir differences between Washington and Oregon. So eastern Washington, primarily warm climate grapes that you've got up there, but 95% of the vineyards are on the Missoula flood sediments. Now remember back at the beginning I said that the winemaker wants to reduce the amount of vigor. And so how do you control the vigor? And because, Burns, you just told us that the Missoula flood sediments are very nutrient rich. Yes, they do it because they irrigate. Drip irrigation, they give it just enough water to keep the plants alive. And that way, that's how you control the vigor. But down here in Oregon, where we use mostly dry land farming, 90% of the vineyards are on the sides of the valleys. And only 10% are on the valley bottoms. And why? Because we control the vigor by using those old, worn-out soils that have less nutrients that are in there. It's interesting, 2 years ago, Oregon turned 150 years old. Well, a professor at Oregon State, myself, and then a guy with the State Geological Survey put together posters that were in the lobby of the Capitol for 2 years. And it was 150 million years of history in Oregon, geological history. So we had the volcanoes, we had our fossils, we had our earthquakes, etc. But the 16th panel that we had down there in the rotunda for 2 years, I entitled it Pints and Pinots. And so the geology is we grow all the pinos on the valley sides in the old soils. And what do we grow on the valley bottoms? Well, hazelnuts or filberts for you native Oregonians, but the other thing, hops. And so it's a great place for hops. And so the pints come out of the valley bottoms on the Missoula flood sediments, the pinots come on the side. Now, I want to take you back up to Washington because Christophe Baron is a very interesting guy. He's from France. He's from the Champagne area. And he has a winery, Cayuse, which I've misspelled, and I feel embarrassed that I haven't changed that. But he came to the Walla Walla area, and he was looking for a perfect vineyard. And so the real estate agent was taking him around. And as they were taking him around, they were looking at pieces of land, 20,000 an acre, 15,000 an acre, $18,000 an acre. And he said, this isn't what I want, isn't what he wants. And so they were very close to the Oregon border in the Walla Walla Valley, and they were going across the bottomland there. And Christophe said to the real estate agent, stop. Let's take a look at this. And the guy says, oh, you don't want this. This is bottomland. It's only just gravel here. And Christophe said, well, how much is this land going for here? And he said, oh, it's about $3,000 an acre, something like that. Nobody wants this. And so he looked at it, and it looked kind of like this. And he said, well, I'll buy it. And you can see the vineyard that he has back here, and it's one of the most successful vineyards there because he understands Bordeaux. You don't have to have all of the soil that is there. The deep rooting that you will get from here. He doesn't even have a wine tasting room. The only way you can buy his grapes or his wines are through a very, very restricted mailing list. I don't think he's gotten below a 95 in either the Wine Spectator or Wine Advocate. He's been very, very successful. And so understanding the soils can be very, very important. Now, I wanted to show you, just to end up with, a new development at Oregon State in the enology and viticulture program that is down there. Very exciting. And as I look around the room, we do have a few older people that are here. And this is the land of Pinot, where we have the Pinot Blanc, Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris. And they're developing a new hybrid grape that acts as an anti-diuretic, and is expected to reduce the number of trips that older people have to the restroom every night, and it's going to be marketed as Pinot More. And so look for this on the shelves very, very soon. So if you fell asleep at the beginning of the talk, now it's time to wake up. And what was I talking about? Well, the importance of terroir. And I talked about 7 factors, and anybody you talk to who's going to talk about terroir, they're going to all have different approaches. But generally all the characteristics that they're going to have are going to be tied up somewhere in mine. And I talk about those first 5 as being the true terroir and the geology. But geology and soil is important. Is it the most important? No. In the Willamette Valley, we control everything by the old soils. Up in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, they control it by irrigation. We're cool climate grapes here. Eastern Washington, primarily warm climate grapes that you have up there. So that's my story on terroir. I showed you some from around the world. It's always exciting to dig pits. It's always exciting to sip those wines, to see how the soils have affected, how the climate has. And so hopefully all of you can leave tonight and say, I am a terroirist. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk tonight.